for a very interesting seminar by Dr. Toby Ault from Cornell University, where he is an assistant professor. And I thank him for driving from Ithaca to here in this icy weather. And so in terms of background, Toby Ault did his undergraduate studies in mathematics at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. But for his PhD and master's degrees, he went to climate in the University of Arizona in Tucson, where his advisors were Julie Coase and Jonathan Overbeck, and he wrote a dissertation on actually the drought in Western America, a very important topic in the history of climate in this country, and you may be aware. And so Toby Ault has many distinct accomplishments of distinction in his career. I would mention a few of them. So he did his PhD in 2011, and as of now he has 22 refereed publications and 6 under review at this time. So a tremendous record of productivity. And he showed his brilliance in his student years. He was, of course, an NSF graduate research fellow, but also in the University of Arizona there is the Galileo Foundation, and they select the most promising graduate student in all physical sciences, and Toby Ault will be on that award. And that after his PhD, he was a postdoctoral fellow at NCAR in their advanced studies program. So let us welcome Toby Ault.
Well, thank you. I'm going to actually start with a story from my postdoc. This is a picture I took from my iPhone after we were evacuated from the Mesa lab in 2012 because of the fires. It was the afternoon, heard the lightning strike. About 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, there was just a little black trail of smoke, like ink, rising up from the other side of the mountains. This is the Mesa lab right here, for those of you who have been to Boulder. To just on the other side of the mountains, we saw this little black ink trail of smoke. Within another 20-25 minutes, the reconnaissance planes flew out from the nearby Air Force Base and did a loop. And within about another 45 minutes, the loudspeaker came on telling us to evacuate the building as the mountains behind us started to look more and more like Mordor from Lord of the Rings. So this is when I got off my bike after being evacuated to take a picture of what was going on. Later that same summer, I was in a wedding in Iowa. Excuse me, it wasn't Iowa. This is a picture from Iowa. I was in a wedding party in St. Louis. The whole Midwest was affected by a very strong drought during the summer of 2012. And the corn, this is Iowa corn, but the corn in Missouri looked about like this as well. They're calling it the corn apocalypse of 2012. Maybe that's what the Mayans were actually predicting. And then this is just from last week. This is the drought monitor used. It's collected from subjective assessments of regional decision makers and planners about the state of the climate of drought on the ground from a bunch of different regions throughout the U.S., counties from the U.S. It's collated and disseminated as a map every week. And it's looked a lot like this for quite some time now. After being evacuated from NCAR and the smoke had cleared from all the floors except for our floor, because my wonderful colleagues on that floor thought it would be really cool to get some pictures by opening up the doors on the top floor and looking at the big fires coming up. Well, of course, when you open the doors and there's smoke pouring down, that smoke goes right into your floor. So the only floor that smelled like smoke when we came back into the building was our floor. So after the smoke had cleared, mostly, my advisor, my mentor, Clara Desser, who's a very famous climate scientist, asked me, she knew I was working on Megadrought. She asked me, is this a megadrought? And of course, as a postdoc, you want to give a really good answer. So I was like, yes. Well, no. Maybe. And what I should have said was, wait 20 years, and I'll have a better answer. And the reason for the ambiguity is, of course, that the definition of megadrought, prolonged drought, isn't really very well constrained. Now I'm going to put this up here and let you read it. This is the Wikipedia definition of megadrought. And maybe all of you already know this, but apparently if you read a definition of megadrought out loud at a talk like NAGU or AMS, then you are quotable as saying things like, they constitute a threat to civilization. And if you say something like that, certain news outlets might be tempted to use that quote as a very compelling way to package a story. So now you've been warned. If you say something, if you read a quote from Wikipedia, you are on the record saying that megadroughts or other types of climate hazards constitute a threat to civilization. And maybe they do, but it's really important in the context of this talk to think about megadrought in terms of decadal to multi-decadal time horizons. The term has been used to characterize shorter but more severe droughts. It's been used to characterize millennial scale climate variability in Eastern Africa. And I think that's fine. But for the rest of this talk, I'm really going to be referring to the decadal and multi-decadal time horizons, which are, I think of as being the classic timescales for thinking about megadrought. This is really just a crude schematic picture of what we're talking about here. We've got the US Dust Bowl, 1930s, and the size of these dots that I'm going to show is proportional to the geographic scale of the droughts. The magnitude in terms of the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is a widely used drought index, is shown on the y-axis, so worse being lower, and the duration is shown on the x-axis. Some of you have probably heard of Australia's Big Dry, about a 10-year drought recently, beginning of this millennium. A little bit smaller, and maybe not quite as severe as the US Dust Bowl. The Amazon, these are all examples that have been in the literature and in the public media. These have been called megadrought. This Amazon drought, 2005, during dry season, it's big, intense, but it was really a seasonal phenomenon. It didn't necessarily persist for beyond the year of 2005. And then, of course, the big granddaddy of them all is the Sahel drought, which is definitely a multi-decadal megadrought, probably the only really good example of a multi-decadal megadrought during the historical period. And the consequences of this event are still being felt in parts of Africa, even today.
Could we go back one slide?
Yes.
For, yeah. Whoop. No, I'm sorry. Yeah. I want to look at the mega undroughts and their
Mega fluvials.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that the distinction between drought and pluvial is a good one, because the impacts of a prolonged wet period are really harder to tease out, because it could be wet on average without being extreme, and that might not cause a lot of damage. It might just kind of be nice. And an example of that is when the Colorado River Compact was designed and the budgets for the Colorado River were being established. It was an anomalously wet period, and people had a more optimistic view of how much water would be available. And I will get to that when I talk about this Colorado Streamflow. So the other end of this extreme, in terms of persistence, isn't necessarily as consequential as the dry end.
What's the definition of a drought? Is it different for different continents?
It's going to depend, yeah. I mean, it's very regionally specific. And it's also not only specific to different parts of the world, but also to the types of uses of water. So there's meteorological drought, which for rain-fed systems might matter. There's agricultural drought, which is a little bit more prolonged. Hydrologic drought for stream flow, stream-fed agriculture. And interannual, decadal, multi-decadal. Those are the time horizons. And the graph that I put up here now highlights where I'm going with most of this talk. We've got on the x-axis here time scale. This is just conceptually where we're coming from with this research. Time scale and then data types. So obviously, and then this is like the precision or maybe the accuracy, the usefulness in terms of the detailed information you get from each of these data types. So for satellite data, you get a lot of information, but the coverage isn't very long. Very high resolution, but not very long coverage. For instrumental data, you have days, weeks, out to decades, but of course it's spatially incomplete, station data. And there are statistical methods for filling in the gaps between stations, but fundamentally it's not as spatially complete as something like a satellite record. And you get onto paleoclimate archives, which by and large don't have sub-annual resolution, and in most cases only have decadal resolution. The tree ring record is different, it has annual resolution. So at the best you've got annual resolution. And each of these levels you're losing some of the precision with which you're able to record or understand climate information. And then you get onto the global climate models, which ostensibly can cover all these different time scales from days out to centuries to millennia by running them. But of course they are model representations of reality, and you open up a whole different can of worms for trying to understand climate phenomena. And the accuracy or the precision of the information that you get from those types of archives or those types of records from paleoclimate or climate model simulations is different from observational data. But for megadrought, for prolonged drought, we're really out in this regime of decades to centuries. And because of that, we have to come at the problem with all the tools that we've got in our arsenal. And this is going to include instrumental data, paleoclimate archives, and global climate models to try to characterize the amplitude of variability in climate on those timescales, the magnitude of droughts, the duration, to try to get at the dynamics and the statistics of megadrought. So we'll begin with some insights from the instrumental period. This is a picture from Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. This is an event, a dust storm, that during the Dust Bowl stretched several thousands of kilometers ultimately across the Great Central Plains all the way out into the eastern seaboard. And it created almost a complete blackout for people on the ground. When I was driving last night, down to Ithaca, past Greek Peaks, if anyone's familiar with the area, there's these big fields that are probably corn in the summertime, and of course now they're just snow, and snow was blowing across the road. It was very difficult to see the road. And I was thinking about this because the descriptions of people who lived through this event describe dust like snow, just blowing across the plains, out into the roads, blocking roads, flipping over cars. People died from the dust, from dust pneumonia during the drought. That was a very impactful event. People who lived through it and went on to fight in World War II still describe the Dust Bowl years as the worst hard times. That's the title of the book from which this information is based. That it was such a painful period in American history for the people who were right at the epicenter of this natural disaster that the scars still, I think, live on culturally today. Here's another picture from that era. You can see a car completely buried after a dust storm, or half buried. Another important drought during the historical period, during the instrumental period, is the 1950s drought in the Southwest, which has received less attention but was also very painful for farmers and ranchers in the region. And you hear about this a lot in Arizona. I got an email recently from Cornell alum, fourth-generation Texan farmer. And he sort of wanted to know if what we're here, basically the same question that Clara Desser was asking. Is this a megadrought? And he talked about, in his email, the 1950s were really, really bad. So now here we've just got two time series of precipitation, annual precipitation records. That's shown in gray. On top, I've applied a just moving 10-year smoothing window, so 10-year average of precipitation for both the Great Plains and the Southwest. And this threshold is half of a standard deviation below average. And these two gray windows highlight those two periods. Now, the threshold of half a standard deviation is, I admit, a little bit arbitrary, but it does do a nice job of capturing the intervals when there was a drought in both these two regions in the historical record that we think we know about. And it also shows only one during this entire period for those two regions. So the decadal scale droughts of the historical record, precipitation alone, can be reasonably well captured with this simple definition of a half a standard deviation in the 10-year average. So we can use that and move on to start to think about the paleoclimate record in the same units and look for the same kinds of events, decadal droughts in the paleoclimate record. This is a picture from some mountains in southern Colorado. Down here, we've got Connie Woodhouse, who is a dendroclimatologist extraordinaire from the University of Arizona, coring trees. She's She has probably one of the most comprehensive data sets from that region, coring hundreds, literally hundreds of trees, field season after field season, out in the Southwest and especially the Southern Rockies. And I worked a little bit with her on one of the papers, and I had some really good friends and colleagues when I was in graduate school that were a few years ahead of me. And once they'd finished, and they knew I was interested in working on Megadrought and using the paleoclimate records, especially the tree ring records, to try to characterize these phenomena. And they convinced me that what I really needed to do was a study abroad at my own university. They convinced me that I should ask Dave Miko, who's also a dendroclimatologist, if I could just park myself in his office for a semester and learn how tree ring science is done at the University of Arizona. It's a world-famous tree ring lab. People do come from everywhere to learn dendroclimatology there. It was across campus from the building I was in. And it did seem like a good idea to try to get a grasp on the underlying principles of dendroclimatology. Now, they've moved. But for those of you who know about the lab, it was at the time, and for many years, situated right back here, which is convenient if you're getting hungry on a Saturday afternoon and you want a hot dog, because the offices were literally across the hall from the concession stands. So you go in and there's this rich, this greasy smell of like soda pop and potato chips. And then you go into the offices, and of course it's replaced by this deep, delicious pine from all the samples that they've got stored in their offices. Now they've moved since then. And by the way, everybody who works in the tree ring lab is, I swear, I don't know, maybe this is just because I was watching The Hobbit last night after I got in, but I swear they're all characters straight out of the Lord of the Rings. They've got these beards, Malcolm Hughes, the Hughes of Man, Bradley, and Hughes would walk down the hallway when I was there and pontificate about the meaning of tree ring science and the role of humans in the universe with his thick Scottish brow. What I learned during my little study abroad, primarily as it applies to megadrought, to prolonged drought, persistence, is that people like Connie Woodhouse and Dave Miko and the rest of the tree ring scientists, the work of many hundreds of people, probably thousands of people over the last 100 years of this field, go out. They don't cut down the trees. It's a misconception if you think they cut down the trees. They don't cut down the trees. They go out with the Swedish coring devices, which is a tool that's been around since the 1600s to do forestry in originally Scandinavia and Sweden. Drill them in, sample these long cores, going all the way, trying to go all the way to the pith, the center of each tree, probably 2 samples per tree, many trees in a given region. And the idea there is that you want to find sites. You use some principles of dendrochronology to find sites where climate is the limiting factor on growth. So a counterexample might be an ecosystem like the Amazon, where climate plays second fiddle to other factors like competition between species or between trees. Whereas in the Southwest, you've got these widely spaced trees growing on marginal regions in the mountains where if it's wet one year, there's a lot of soil moisture available, the trees are going to grow more, and if it's dry the next year, they're going to grow less, relatively. At the same time, one has to factor in the biological and non-climate effects that are present in raw ring width measurements. So what you get back in the lab is a series of relatively narrow and wide rings, but with some long-term biological change. That might partly reflect the fact that when a tree is really small, it can grow big fat rings without much energy because it's just putting on less mass as opposed to when it's getting larger. That's just a geometric argument. There's also biological factors as a tree switches from putting on more woody material to establish itself when it's young and investing more energy later when it's older in reproduction. So there's non-climate factors on long time scales that we really need to worry about to characterize megadroughts. The way that this is traditionally dealt with is by fitting a spline or some other type of parametric line to the long-term growth. In this case, it's a spline that I fit to these individual segments. These would be measurements made from a single core, from a single tree, of different lengths through time. Fitting a spline, and then using that spline, that low-frequency growth curve, or non-climate curve, as a method for detrending the data and normalizing it. Once you've detrended it and normalized it, you have what you can think of as being z-scores that are going to be combined together to produce a chronology. So a chronology is a compilation of tree-ring width indices. Tree-ring width indices are detrended tree-ring width measurements. Multiple chronologies are used in a reconstruction. And I wanted to go through this slowly because it's an important point that I think gets overlooked, especially in the popular science version of dendroclimatology, and certainly in my own misconceptions before doing my little study abroad. No reconstruction is based on one tree. We're talking about usually dozens to maybe even hundreds of trees going into one chronology, and dozens, maybe hundreds of chronologies going into one reconstruction. In this case, this is from Miko et al.'s 2007 paper on Colorado River streamflow over the last millennium, in which they do identify megadroughts, several megadroughts. These are the sites, the chronologies that went in, and of those chronologies, each one is composed of many tree-ring width indices. There's a well-known limitation, however, in all of this. It's a well-known limitation called the segment length curse. Even if you were the most skillful detrender of tree-ring data in the world, if you had the best, most statistically robust, insightful, profound method for detrending, for removing biological non-climate growth, even then, the amount of low-frequency variability, when I say low-frequency, I'm talking decadal, multi-decadal, and century-scale variability. The amount of low-frequency variability that you could retain would be proportional to the shortest segments, because you just can't capture long time scales with a bunch of short segments. It can't be done. It's removed. It's gone. So you want long segments if you want to get long time scales of variability, long individual cores to comprise your chronologies. To deal with this particular problem, in the Miko 2007 reconstruction, they made sure that every single segment was detrended in more or less the same way, one of two ways, and also that every single segment was at least 250 years long, which gave them confidence they were preserving the magnitude, the amplitude of fluctuations up to about 150 to 100 year time scales. This is what the reconstruction looks like. This is actually just the running average, the 25-year running average of the reconstruction through time from 800 to 2000. The observed flow is plotted over top in this thick black line. And the uncertainty in the reconstruction, there's a reconstruction uncertainty, is shown in gray. The most salient feature, the one that has received by far the most attention in the literature and also by water resource managers, is this 1150s drought. It's actually a really nice example of a negative half a standard deviation in the running 10-year mean. It actually fits our criteria for decadal drought on par with the 1950s or the 1930s. It's the longest one in this record, but there are others. They tend to occur, these decadal droughts tend to occur at a rate of about 1 or 2 per century. We looked at some other reconstructions of hydroclimate. Got the same one up there, the Miko et al. Colorado streamflow. Ed Cook from Lamont, 2004 PDSI reconstructions for the Southwest, and Staley et al. 2011 PDSI. Different regions, same criteria for identifying decadal drought. They're not all synchronous, which kind of implies that there might be a spatial scale associated with some of these events that isn't the whole West, but might be more regional. But you do get a very similar number of events, 1 to 2 per century for these decadal droughts. At the same time, if you broaden the time horizon of interest from 10 years to 35 years to try to get at the multi-decadal megadrought horizon, this would be on par with the Sahel drought of Africa. So multi-decadal megadrought, 35 years, and use that same magnitude threshold of half a standard deviation, negative half a standard deviation. There are at least 3 in this particular grid box of the Southwest. And the ratio that you get for the reasonably stationary climate, reasonably stable climate of the last millennium, how likely are megadroughts? From a paleoclimate perspective, and this number has been around for a while, and it's held up reasonably well, and it held up with this analysis. For decadal, 10-year drought, 1 to 2 per century, and for multi-decadal megadrought, 1 to 2 per millennium. These are rare events in a historical record, in a paleoclimate, high-resolution, last millennium perspective. And this applies to most of the West. I'm going to move on to talk about the continuum and the power spectrum that I think is a really powerful way to talk about decadal drought, multi-decadal megadrought, because it gives us an opportunity to compare paleoclimate archives, natural variability in those archives, with long climate model simulations without necessarily expecting that the natural variabilities are going to be in phase in the paleoclimate record and in the long climate model simulation. We wouldn't expect that. In fact, if the variability is unforced, we would expect it to be different from the realization that mattered, the real one, on our real planet over the last 1,000 years, and the simulations. I think the power spectrum offers us an opportunity to do that because we're only looking at the amplitude of variances across timescales. Here, we've got frequency in inverse years. So this would be centennial timescales, multi-decadal, interannual. A red power spectrum is going to have this slope towards more variance at long timescales. A white noise power spectrum would be like a uniform distribution across the timescales of interest. And you do, in some models, actually see blue power spectra if you're sampling them at annual resolution. And an example of this we were talking about this morning is the CCSM3 model, which had an El Nino event every other year. So it's like a ping pong ball being batted back and forth, and you're sampling it every time step. And so you have the most variance at the shortest frequencies. It's a kind of an unusual system in nature, but you do see it in the models. I returned from my study abroad and reread this paper by Hoybers and Curry. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It's one of those papers that I reread from time to time. There's so much in it. It's a great paper. It answers so few questions and asks so many. It really raises more questions than it answers. What's shown here is a compilation of power spectra calculated from proxies that are direct temperature proxies. The terrestrial proxies, so this is mostly the Greenland ice core, some other ones on land, are shown up top. They have more variance, which we expect because terrestrial climates have more variance than ocean climates. There's no modulating effect by the heat capacity of the oceans. These are marine proxies. Hoybers and Curry point out that there seems to be maybe this interesting inflection point right around 100 years where the slope steepens as maybe you start to feel the effects of orbital changes in the climate system. And they posit that there's this interesting continuum, that there's a relationship between the annual cycle and the continuum, and there's a lot of unanswered questions about the climate system on long time scales that could be relevant for climate modeling and for global climate change. So you read this as a graduate student, you think, yeah, I'm going to do that with hydroclimate for the drought to Southwest. And right away, it becomes necessary to try to frame things in a null hypothesis, especially knowing what I already knew at that point about persistence in tree ring chronologies and tree ring width measurements, which is that there is a potential non-climate source of persistence of autocorrelation, not only from soil moisture, which is well known. I mean, everybody knows that if it's wet in the Southwest during April, the chances are it's going to retain a lot of that moisture into May. But there's also, for tree ring width indices, there's storage of carbohydrates in the needles of the trees that can mitigate or alleviate one dry year if the previous year was good. So there's two potential sources of autocorrelation that we tried to get at to try to test this null hypothesis. So you can think of this as a generalized conceptual model of a proxy where you've got some white noise input into your archive, tree ring, maybe cave, maybe something else, some autocorrelation that reddens the spectrum and emphasizes the low frequency variations beyond what you'd get from the input alone. This is your classic model of an AR1, first order AR1 process. So say this is true in width at any time is proportional to the previous year times some autocorrelation coefficient plus noise. The null hypothesis that we wanted to use was really only factoring in soil moisture, using the PDSI as a benchmark. And the reason for this is that PDSI is really simple to deal with in this context, since the autocorrelation parameter isn't resolved. It doesn't arise from the dynamics of the model of soil moisture in the PDSI index. It's actually prescribed. It's prescribed as 0.897, an empirical estimate from like the 1960s. It's still used. And for the West, it's pretty good. Autocorrelation of soil moisture in most of the West and Southwest is about 0.9. So this number of 0.897 which is just prescribed from one month to the next to carry information along through time, seems to be pretty good agreement with the observations for the Southwest. Because we know the autocorrelation coefficient, we can calculate the theoretical AR1 spectrum, analytical AR1 spectrum. We can also do Monte Carlo simulations of what you would get as far as a power spectrum of 1,000 years in length if the only show in town were stochastic forcing and local autocorrelation proportional to what's in the PDSI. So this gives us a nice benchmark for the low frequency variability, decadal and centennial variability in hydroclimate for the Southwest. So now we throw up against that benchmark all the data basically all the data we can get our hands on, with some screening. So we didn't just use everything. We targeted reconstructions that had made attempts to preserve low frequency variability, either through the detrending or through the inclusion of long segments. And we targeted proxies of the reconstructions that were hydroclimate indicators primarily. And what you can see is at the highest frequencies, there's interesting stuff happening, and this makes sense because the Southwest has a lot of interannual variability. A lot of that's driven by ENSO. But out into the decadal and multi-decadal and even century time horizons, these two, the flow reconstructions and the precip reconstructions, are within AR1 expectations. They're within, they can't reject the null hypothesis on the basis of those alone. We dug in a little bit deeper, and even though attempts were made, there's probably more that could have been done to preserve the long time scales of variability. Talked to Connie Woodhouse about what we were doing, and she had just finished putting together this 5-needle pine database. It's really a pristine database. The segments were all very long, I think 500 years or longer. And the detrending was conservative to build this 5-needle pine database. So you've got long segments and conservative detrending, which should give you the best chances of preserving that low frequency variability. And sure enough, it just sort of rises up a little bit above the noise. And we looked at some other coarser resolution paleoclimate indices from other types of archives, lakes and caves, and they also have this redness beyond what can be accommodated by the AR1 model. And I think, at least for now, we're rejecting that null hypothesis. In other words, there's more interesting stuff happening than can be explained or can be accommodated by local sources of autocorrelation alone. And we can move on then to do some statistical modeling, some stochastic modeling of prolonged drought with these considerations in mind. This is the statistical perspective.
So then,
Yes.
Question.
Yes.
So do we I don't know anything about tree growth.
Sure.
Do we really understand the 100-year type of thing to do? As you said, it's conservative.
Yeah. It's an open question.
So if there's something that we don't understand about this sort of long-term growth of trees, then they will be present.
And usually that's removed. But when it's removed, then what you get is a completely stable chronology with very little variability, very deficient, like almost I would say pathological. Actually, if you look at it, it's significantly low on the longest timescales because you've removed them. So with very aggressive detrending, you end up with significantly non-energetic low-frequency variability. That's not considered to be right or wrong. It's just not known at this point. I think the best test for this hasn't been done yet. And the best test for this would be to see how coherent, in a multivariate sense, are the chronologies and the ring widths across some large spatial scale. Because we would expect that if it's climate, it should be correlated from one site to the next site across some sufficiently large or small geographic domain. That hasn't really been done in a systematic way to weigh in on exactly that question.
Just a related question. If you're looking at a given tree,
Yep.
does the tree diameter increase linearly with time, or is it like a human being? It has its use grows rapidly, then maturity stops?
It depends on the tree. Depends on the species, depends on the environment, depends on the pathologies of that individual tree. A lot of them look like a negative exponential, and that's a widely used approach. Another one that was employed in the 1970s by Lamarche, who was a Turing scientist in the sort of dawning era of this field, was to just say, look, we see the growth for the first 100 or 150 or 200 years. Let's just ignore that. I mean, he's working with these pristine chronologies that are 800 or 1,000 or 1,200 years long, one tree, not even one tree, compilations of trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years long. So he's just throwing out the first part where there's growth and then looking at the variability that's left over. We tried that too, and you get a very similar picture to the five-needle pine story. But it's, you know, we're at the edge of our ability to make really, really precise inferences about climate. So you have to put together a multifaceted picture here. So for the modeling part, for the stochastic modeling part, the model that we use, start with white noise, which is easy enough to rescale to be an AR1 process, which is what we do. So you see up top here, this is just to emphasize that at the short time scales, these considerations almost don't even matter. The differences you get between white noise, AR1, and a power law distribution within the bounds of our, sort of within the parameter space from the paleoclimate data, are really small. Less than 1/10 of a standard deviation. But on the long time scales, for megadrought, for persistence, they do matter. So you look at like the running mean, which is what we're going to use to detect megadroughts. There's a big difference between the power law distribution, which drops below this threshold and stays there for quite a while, and the white noise distribution. You'll see this really well in the next picture down here, where if you just, I think we did, I don't know, 100,000 realizations in 50-year chunks. And the likelihood of getting a multi-decadal megadrought, a 35-year drought of a half a standard deviation, for a white noise process is really small. Yeah, less than 5%. I think it was less than 4%. For AR1, almost 5%. But for power law, non-negligible, 15%. Because the persistence is just a more important term on the long time scales, which means you can stay low for a long time, or you can stay high for a long time, and you can get a megadrought. So with those baseline estimates, which are actually, by the way, very consistent with the paleoclimate picture as far as risk goes, we can move on to the modeling perspective. And I'm sure everyone's basically familiar with the idea of global climate models. I want to emphasize that these are fully coupled models that we're going to be talking about. Ocean atmosphere, in some cases they're EASM, so the whole Earth system. Not looking at the more simplified EMIX or any downscaled results. Here's an example from Jerry Meals, 2012 Journal of Climate paper looking at changes that are predicted for the future from one model, the CCSM4 model. This paper was published right after I got to NCAR. You see the historical period in red. This is globally average temperature. These dips are volcanoes. It's a 6-member ensemble. That's giving us the standard deviation used for the uncertainty through time. These dips are volcanic eruptions. This is Pinatubo. The long-term trend is mostly greenhouse gases, and then these are the different representative concentration pathways, the RCPs. So RCP 8.5 is 8.5 watts per meter squared of additional forcing by the end of the 21st century. And sure enough, you see more warming with more forcing. This is a standard application of models. One of the things that one needs to just always, especially for me, I always need to remind myself of this, because you got everything. You're working with a model, you've got so much better than paleoclimate data. You don't have to worry about detrending. You've got every single field resolved. You don't have to worry about seasonality. You don't have to worry about proxy type. It's just great. You just dive headfirst into these things and pull out whatever you're looking for. And that's the problem. You can find a lot of what you're looking for. And so these are some caveats that are relevant here. There are more. This is an abbreviated list. Systematic biases. This is one that was documented by John Fasulo and Kevin Trenberth a couple years ago. Reproduced their figure because the paper wasn't published when I was working on this figure. But then they scooped me. So this is GPCP, global average, through time. Not much of a trend. And then plotted above it are the actual mean precipitation, globally average precipitation for a bunch of the CMA5 models in millimeters per day. Most of them have this trend. Most of them see Pinatubo, and most of them are a little bit too wet. They're moving around too much moisture, and they're trending as a response to the forcing. And that appears to be inconsistent with the observations. Could be the observations are wrong. Could be that the trend is real and the observations are wrong. But that's one potential source of bias that we should be aware of. Another one that we focused on was the distribution of variance across timescales in the historical simulations and the controls in just precipitation alone. This map shows you the ratio of interannual variance to decadal variance. Interannual variability to decadal variability. In red, it would be 1-to-1. So decadal variability and interannual variability are about as strong. The lighter yellower colors are where interannual variability really dominates the power spectrum. There's a mix in GPCC, and we looked at all the sort of standard global precipitation products and got a very similar picture, very similar maps for the other types of products. We looked at the CMA5. This is just the ensemble average, but the individual members showed a similar story. The ratio of interannual variability to decadal variability in precipitation in the models seems to be a lot lower. In other words, interannual decadal variance in models is almost 1-to-1, or in some cases, really the interannual timescales dominate. Whereas in reality, it doesn't look like that. It looks like decadal timescales might be more important in reality. The subtle bias, and there's lots of reasons why we might need to look more carefully at that result. And one of them probably has to do with the forcing and the long timescales. And so one of the other things that we looked at in terms of model bias was these last millennium simulations, where the external conditions are prescribed, so volcanic eruptions, solar variability, changes in land use, and then, of course, changes in greenhouse gases towards the end of the 20th century, and 19th century, 20th century. Just go through those again. This is not necessarily a good forcing region. This is from Russia, but it's an amazing picture. So there it is. I mean, look at that picture. Yeah, we're just looking down from space. It's a satellite picture. Looking down from space at a big volcanic eruption in Russia on June 12th, 2009. The NASA photo. And you've got solar variability. This is reconstructed from carbon-14, beryllium-10, which is recorded, which is archived in ice cores. So beryllium-10 is produced when cosmic rays penetrate the Earth's atmosphere and create this unstable isotope. When the solar variability is at its maximum, this is the most total solar insolation. It causes more scattering of the cosmic rays, which protects the Earth and reduces the production of beryllium-10. That's what's been used to infer total solar insolation variability through time. And then this is a weak forcing, but it's the orbital component, which relates to the timing of northern hemisphere summer during the Earth's trip around the sun. And 1,000 years ago, we were slightly closer to the sun during the northern hemisphere equinox. It's a potentially important term, but it's a really, really weak one. It doesn't affect the total amount of radiation, just the timing and the distribution of that radiation. So you can see them all together. This gives you a sense for the time scales. Volcanic eruptions are very punctuated, short, big. Total solar insolation has this 11-year cycle that's imposed. This is not a feature of the reconstruction, but it's a feature of the forcing data set that's used. They imposed the 11-year cycle. And also the multi-century variability. But in total, we're talking about like less than about 1% of change from today in the solar forcing. And then the long-term trend from precession. Here's a little animation to show you what sea surface temperatures do in response to those forcings. This is a low frequency, so bandpass filtered sea surface temperature data set from CCSM4, so the climate model that I was working with when I was at NCAR. Up top is the top of the atmosphere forcing in watts per meter squared, so it integrates the solar, precessional, and volcanic contributions. You can see the volcanic contributions are dominating. This event, which we're going to get to, 1258, it's an eruption that if you look at the total net radiation at the top of the atmosphere, it scales to about 25 times Pinatubo in the forcing. And yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, exactly. Good question. I'm skeptical. It's partly that the model is too sensitive, and it's partly that I think that the forcing is too strong.
There's a huge volcanic eruption in New Zealand. The equator is like 20 miles across.
Maybe.
That one was traced to Indonesia.
Okay.
What?
This one is.
59 was traced 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's The more recent studies of this, that I think just there was like a Nature Geoscience or Nature Climate Change paper last fall, I want to say, that argued for it being separate eruptions that look like one in the ice core record. Anyway, it has like the century-long effect on sea surface temperature, and we might expect that that has implications for hydroclimate as well. There's other interesting stuff going on. When you look out here to Pinatubo, we extended this all the way out to the 20th century. Pinatubo it's just a little blip compared to these big eruptions of the past. In the model, in the forcing data set for the model. All right. Recap on the null hypothesis, which we're going to use. We're going to use this analytical AR1 spectrum as well as the Monte Carlo confidence limits to evaluate the GCM, all the GCMs eventually, starting with GCM4 and then the rest of them. And even with that strong multi-decadal century scale forcing from the volcanism and the orbital changes and the solar variability, you just don't see much in hydroclimate that compares with the paleoclimate record. And we don't have any reason to believe that the paleoclimate record on those long time scales is reddening the power spectrum beyond just autocorrelation. So this discrepancy needs to be reconciled. That's a systematic bias in models that we should worry about. Another one is the small ensemble size. Here's a really idealized example of how this might play out. Say you've got a 4-member ensemble from one GCM, and you're interested in some phenomena, like Megadrought. Well, if you haven't sampled the full distribution, the full probability space, which maybe looks more like this, your estimates of the likelihood of an event are going to be off until you have a larger ensemble, or until you find a way to mimic or emulate the statistics of that small ensemble. This is the same example shown a little bit of a different way. Clearly idealized time series here, where for the first 100 years, you have a mean of 0, and then you shift that mean by a tiny amount. I think we use like a tenth or a fifth of a standard deviation, and then you look at the likelihood of megadrought. Well, in this case, we've got one realization that has a megadrought and one that doesn't. Does that mean that the likelihood of megadrought is 50%? No. It just means we haven't run enough Monte Carlo simulations to say what the likelihood is. But if you only have 2, you only have enough computer time and your climate model to run 2 simulations, you can't make a meaningful statement about the likelihood because you just don't have enough of the PDF sample of the future. And then the last thing I want to talk about, we haven't really addressed, but I think it's a fascinating feature of climate models. They're not necessarily independent because they have shared components of code. And this has been described by Mason Canuti and others. It's really an interesting result. And I really don't know what to make of it. Every time I see this, I think about it a little more. And I'd love to do something more useful. But what they've done is they've applied methods that are common in like biology to group different species, phenotypes, based on traits. They've used this to look at model statistics and group them. And when they've done this, you end up with groups of models on the same branches of the tree that are actually produced by the same institutions. And you have breaks in the branches of the tree that reflect points in time in the past when code was shared between institutions, cross-pollination. It's really interesting because the implications there are that the structural dependency of the model through time might be playing out in weird ways when you look at the whole ensemble. Because they're not necessarily independent, even though they are initialized and run in different ways at different institutions. They might have like model DNA that's the same. And I'm not sure that anyone has come up with a really great way for dealing with that. One of the craziest parts of this particular area of research is that in the Hadley perturbed physics experiments, where you would expect things to be really crazy because they just tweaked physical parameters within the model and then did these simulations, some of which produced very unrealistic climates. Even then, they end up looking like beetles. Any Beatles fans? A lot of diversity in beetles, very different functional traits in beetles, but they're all beetles. Well, you get all of the Hadley models branching from the same part of the tree, even though they're really different from each other and really unrealistic. There's structural dependencies there that need to be accommodated. But those considerations notwithstanding, we can try to assess the likelihood of megadroughts in precipitation alone from models, using emulators to generate the noise field, the forcing, or the noise component, based on some difference between the historical period and some future period for each of the different RCPs. is the white noise emulator, Air 1 emulator, and power law. And you get this distribution where risk tends to increase with forcing and with the low frequency component in the noise model. No surprise there. For decadal drought, multi-decadal megadrought. This is a combination of climate change, primarily climate change setting the backdrop, and then an additional potential contribution of the low frequency variability, which we think is deficient maybe in the models, and stronger in reality. In either case, the likelihood of megadrought, and this is only looking at precipitation, is fairly high for the Southwest for this century, and for a lot of other parts of the world. There's decadal on the left, multi-decadal on the right. Now, we published this, and no sooner had USA Today proclaimed megadroughts to be a threat to civilization. Then Ben Cook and I were talking, and he basically said, you know, all this power law, frequency distribution stuff is great, but look, when you put in temperature and look at soil moisture, things are much worse than your estimates. The likelihood is much higher. And that was a paper that didn't take very long to write because we had all the data just sitting there. This is results of Ben's work and Jason Smearden's work to compare PDSI and soil moisture in models, and they actually compare very favorably. They're very correlated with each other. Once you normalize them, they're doing pretty much the same thing across timescales. So now we've got the North American Drought Atlas, that's NADA, North American Drought Atlas from Cook Senior's reconstructions of the Southwest, and the Central Plains in the Southwest, through time, compared with PDSI and then two different soil moisture estimates from the models into the future. This is what happens when you factor in the role of temperature, higher temperatures in soil moisture. And it just tanks. It just gets so much drier than anything we've seen in the last 1,000 years. It's really striking, and it's robust across the models. This is for the Central Plains. The blue here is the 1850 to 2005 portion of the models. The red is the shift from climate change. Up top, you've got the NADA. This is for the Central Plains. For the Southwest, here's these kernel density functions, or just PDFs, for the NADA again. This is during the driest period in the NADA, the medieval climate anomaly, the medieval drought. 1100 to 1300. The distribution there is still much closer to today than to what the future looks like in the models, in bulk. And of course, in terms of likelihood of megadrought, decadal or multi-decadal megadrought risk, this weights the dice towards favoring dry, persistently dry conditions very significantly. It pushes us right up to, and in some cases, past that negative half a standard deviation threshold. And it keeps us there in the Southwest. And I was just there. I was there last week. I was in Tucson working on some of the stuff. And I've left the next slide blank because of that trip. Because what people want to know isn't 2050 to 2100. What people want to know is 2015. And we don't have a good answer about 2015. And we're working on it. I mean, everybody is very interested. Everybody, you know, in the scientific community, in the policy community, water resource managers are just screaming out for these decadal and seasonal predictions. And we're not there. And I think we have to be very transparent about not being there yet. So there isn't a slide to go with that particular question. I hope in the next decade, maybe, we'll have some decadal prediction. But I think where our results and Ben's results differ is critical for the next decade, because it's that potential of the natural variations to be strong compared to the forcing that could shape the face of climate change over the coming decade. And ultimately, and this is something that I think is important, whether you're convinced by the science of climate change or not, megadroughts happen. They happen in the past. And so being prepared to handle dry spells lasting 10, 20, 30 years is probably not a terrible idea, regardless of one's view on climate change. Managing water, and it's sort of easy to think about here because we've got lots of it. It falls out of the sky for free, sometimes a lot of it, all at once, in the form of snow and or rain. we get this free drinkable stuff that we can use to grow crops and make energy. And we've got to think about it on longer time horizons than we're used to, with a more, I think, holistic Earth system perspective. And that's where all the communities involved in this can play a really strong role in shaping the dialogue, especially around the drought that's happening right now in California. The lessons that we learn from this drought, I think, will be really valuable in the coming century. And on that note, I mean, some of you maybe remember the 60s, and I was just, I was in Tucson, and it was my wife's mother lived there. She lived in the village in the 60s, and she said she remembered the drought in the 60s when it was, probably one of the most pronounced dry intervals for this part of the world in a while. There were signs in the subway that said, "Save water, shower with a friend." So I was asked by Scholastic magazine, for kids, they're going to do a story on drought, on prolonged drought, and what's some tips that you can give high school students, junior high students, to save water, to fight megadrought? I didn't say shower with a friend. Don't worry. I thought that might have been a little bit inappropriate. But I did say, there's lots we can do. You look at what's going on in Tucson versus just Phoenix. Water conservation is a big deal in Tucson. People don't really have lawns, and people tend to put buckets in their showers because you can use that for your citrus tree in the backyard. And those practices, which everybody can do, and I think are starting to become more commonplace in places like California, can go a long way. And one of the most optimistic pieces in all of this, and this picture kind of shows it, one of the most optimistic points of reference I have in all of this is that our best information about megadroughts comes from trees that didn't get killed by megadroughts. And that's good news, because it doesn't spell out doom. It doesn't spell out the end of civilization. It just spells out challenges to water infrastructure, the way that we use water that we haven't seen. And so if trees survive them, it doesn't mean that there's no water. It just means less. And that's something that we can handle. We're a very creative, adaptive species. And in the beginning, I mentioned there was a paper that talked about millennial scale megadroughts in East Africa. And the relevance was for human dispersion and evolution. But one of the findings that just came out in 2012 was that human populations during these dry episodes didn't really abandon the places that they were inhabiting, which means they just changed what they were doing. So as a species, we've been dealing with megadrought for a while, and I think we can keep doing it. I am optimistic. People of the internet, I am an optimist. I don't think that megadroughts are the greatest threat to civilization. I'll conclude there and take questions. I think we've got some time, hopefully. Thank you.
This statement's a bit of a curiosity. When you were talking about your spectral slope,
yes,
temperature proxy, and
temperature.
I think it was, and there was a slope of minus 1.64 on the log.
Oh, this is the Hoybers and Curry paper?
Yeah.
Yes. So, like, why?
No, well, let me tell you what, I throw something out. I mean, it's probably ridiculous, but in 1942 there was a famous paper by a Russian mathematician by the name of Megadroughts.
Uh-huh.
And for isotropic turbulence in fluids,
Yep.
using dimensional analysis in what's called the inertial subrange, he came up with a spectral slope
Yep.
wave number of minus 5/3, which is 1.66. Now you've got 1.64.
Yeah, plus or minus. Yeah.
Which is 2 parts per thousand different from Megadroughts. And I'm just wondering whether you do dimensional analysis on simple variations of variables that might be creating that. And then you showed that millennial map of sea surface temperature fluctuation. Whether you did a 2D spectral density of that, what would happen?
I think that would be an incredible result. And it's never been done. You're right. It hasn't been done in exactly that way. I've seen it done in a few different ways. And this has been an argument that's been out there for a while. Is there some analog to turbulence that connects the Milankovitch timescales with the climates that we're familiar with today? Is ENSO, climate variations on the shorter timescales, is the PDO or the AMO just like some little swirl in this abstract form of like climate macro turbulence? These are questions that have been asked and haven't been answered. And I don't have a great answer. I think it's worth doing in my free time, or your free time. You should do it, and let me know how it goes. I think it could be an amazing result. I think this defies explanation. This is not a peak associated with Milankovitch. This is a continuum in which Milankovitch plays an important role, but other stuff seems to be happening at every scale, at every octave. It's an interesting thing. I don't think it has a great theoretical explanation that I've seen anyway.
It's probably just a nature of autoregressive model. As a physicist, I've been using that for all kinds of things, all that. And even for the ocean turbulence, you get -2. It's typical of the spectrum of the eddies. So I saw some, the physics use that for economics, DNAs, all kinds of things. There must be some kind of intrinsic property of the autoregressive model. I hope that I don't know exactly why.
One of the things that John Pelletier from the University of Arizona published a number of years ago was a sort of an alternative view. It wasn't supposed. He just explained it to me last week, and it's not an alternative to Milankovitch. It works with Milankovitch, but it is this idea that there's a coupling between ice sheet dynamics, mantle dynamics, and climate. In other words, when you've got big ice sheets, you push down the mantle, and then you lower the elevation of the ice sheets, and so then with some additional forcing, you might be able to grow them or decay them based on that actual, like the coupled physics on the long time scales. So yeah, I think there might be something there. I really do. I don't have any particular view on what that thing might be.
Different questions, I say in US don't have much history, but like Europe or China, you have this long history, right?
Yep.
Lots of relation. So I would think there should be very good record in terms of drought on that large scale. Any people maybe try to verify this so-called trade ring stuff? I think this term looks pretty, but I would bet people tend to calibrate their result with the modern instrument there. So the whole question is this whole thing.
Right. So there's a couple things. The other product that's widely used for drought, there's two. One is from the Southeast Asian region, based on tree reconstructions. It's sort of core monsoon areas. They're good, but they have a different set of limitations from these because seasonality matters a lot. The timing matters, not just the amount. In the Southwest, you get these pristine records that are very sensitive to the amount of rain. Whereas in monsoon regions, it's the timing and the amount that can be really important. And then in Europe, there's a drought atlas as well that's coming online. And to first order at decade-long timescales, there's good correspondence between instrumental records, behavior of civilizations, collapse of civilization. There you go. People of the internet, I said it. And that seems to be true. It seems to be playing out similarly, but it's even messier for Europe. And it's partly messier in Europe because you lack sites where moisture precip is a major control on growth, partly because those sites don't have long records because those trees were used to build ships a long time ago. You don't have the same moisture-sensitive Mediterranean sites because Spain was interested in exploring the New World and chopped a lot of those oaks down.
So I think we will stop here.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all so much.
Yeah, so you can do anything you want, but if there's really no ground truth there, then you can.
They have some. They basically, my understanding is that they basically rebuilt what they had, changed a lot of the machinery, and some expanded more operation. And supposedly, I mean,
Because you can't, there's nothing else.
did you hear the guy who was talking about it here? A year and a half ago? Yeah, it was a long talk. One of the principals
One of those empires, you could not cut down.
probably takes a while to work its way through the system in terms of
Other people, yeah.
and by that time the price went back upward.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't heard any details about how it's all working. It's just tweaking.
There's no wood.
Exactly.
So one of the more exponential percent of New York is trying to get soil movements. It's not all face like it's all about glass.
Drought,
No, a lot of it's compost.
Yeah. Yeah.
You touched on it.
I think it's in my notes.